Hello, my name is Tanya Zanish-Belcher. I'm the Director of Special Collections and Archives. And we're happy to welcome those of you here in person and then those of you available online. But before we get started, I do want to pass along some thank yous to Rebecca, who will be introducing Dr. Friend, and Barry Davis, our tech guru, who manages all of our technology. We really appreciate it. This was one of our first joint programs with the Wake Forest Historical Museum over in Wake Forest, North Carolina. Dr. Friend spoke there yesterday, and I think some of you may have watched his recording from last night, and then we will be live streaming this and recording it as well. Programs such as this would not have been possible without the generosity of Dr. Samuel T. Glading. Dr. Friend is actually our Samuel T. Glading Fellow. Sam, who passed away in 2021, was a very special Wake Forester. He received a Bachelor of Arts in History at Wake Forest, a Master of Arts at Religion at Yale, a Master of Arts in Counseling at Wake Forest, and a PhD in Family Relations at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Glading was very proud of being a double beak. He was a counseling professor who wrote numerous books, including The History of Wake Forest, Volume 6, book chapters, articles, and poems. He was a Wake Forest administrator. He served as a mental health responder for 9/11 and the mass shooting at Virginia Tech. He was a researcher, a writer, a husband, and a father, and as one of his colleagues described him, a gentleman and a scholar. He was a supporter of special collections and archives, and before he passed away, he left a generous donation for us. This endowment, which we are using to support humanities programming, is to honor Sam and give back to Wake Forest students, staff, and faculty, as well as the Winston-Salem and Wake Forest, North Carolina communities. I would especially like to acknowledge Mrs. Claire Glading, who is with us today. We're happy about that. And now I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca for her introduction of Dr. Friend.
I didn't even introduce myself, Dr. Friend. I'm introducing him to you all, but we haven't met. So welcome, everyone. I'll just introduce very quickly. Dr. Craig Thompson Friend is an Alumni Association Distinguished Graduate Professor of History and Public History at North Carolina State University. His areas of expertise and interest include the early American Republic, the Old South, issues of identity, public memory and commemoration, gender and masculinity, and death culture. His research has been funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Antiquarian Society, the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History, and Pew Charitable Trust. He is a former president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic and currently serves as the president-elect of the Historical Society of North Carolina. Dr. Friend has authored and edited numerous books. His most recent work, and subject of today's presentation, Becoming Lunsford Lane, The Lives of an American Aeneas, received the 2025 North Carolinian Book Award from the North Carolinian Society. So welcome, Dr. Friend.
Thank you. And I'll just add one thing, is that I graduated from here in 1983, so I'm a Demon Deacon. And as any good Demon Deacon alumni, I just spent almost $100 at the clothing store. Okay, where's the... So, I thank you for watching the event last night, if you did so, and I'm going to sort of piggyback off that a little bit, but today is sort of independent as well, so if you didn't see that, you should still be able to follow along. Here we go. In autumn 1894, this guy, his name was Stephen Beauregard Weeks. He was the first professional historian in North Carolina. He was a teacher at Trinity College, which is today Duke. And by professional historian, I mean he made a living being a historian and being a history professor. But he was on leave in 1894, and he was in a bookstore in Connecticut, wandering around looking at books. And he picked up one book, this book, and I would encourage you afterwards to come up here and look at them. This book, not this particular book, but this text, he picked up and and looked at it a while, and then he reported in the newspaper back to North Carolina that he had found perhaps the only biography of a North Carolina Negro ever written, and certainly the most extensive biography ever devoted to the life of a native North Carolinian who spent the great part of his life in North Carolina. When Weeks found this, and then later returned to Durham, he began writing, including Lunsford in his conversations about what had happened in North Carolina 50 years earlier. This resurrected Lunsford Lane, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. But first, a brief introduction. Lunsford had been enslaved in North Carolina from his birth in 1803 until he purchased himself, or had a friend help him purchase himself, in 1835. That year, his friend accompanied him to Manhattan, where they found a judge who was willing to grant him emancipation. And so Lunsford returned from Manhattan with his emancipation papers in his pocket, and he lived as a free man until he was forced 5 years later by state magistrates to leave. The legislature refused to help him, and so he left North Carolina, went to first Philadelphia and then New York and then Boston, made connections with abolitionists who were willing to host him, and he would get up at abolitionist meetings and give his story of how he has purchased his freedom. And then the abolitionist would give him good money. Okay, so he's basically soliciting for money. His primary purpose is to return to North Carolina and save his family, purchase his family. At that point, it's his wife Martha and 6 children, all of whom are enslaved, and he needs to buy their freedom. Okay. When he returned to North Carolina in 1842, he's mobbed, was tarred and feathered, barely escaped with his life. There's lots of ironies around that, about how the mob didn't even mean to be mean to him, and they tell him all the time, we're sorry we did that to you. But we needed to do it to show the wealthy white people in town who helped slaves find their freedom that they shouldn't do that. So he survives the tar and feathering, and then he and his family leave town. The next morning he returns to the North a hero. He starts telling the last chapter of his story, which is how he escaped the mob. Abolitionist audiences elevate him into this grand hero of the North, and he's able to basically make money as a speaker, not convincing people of anything, but of just telling that story. He makes money off from that for about a decade, enough to sustain his family, and to actually buy a house or two along the way. And so in the 1840s, he becomes one of the earliest celebrities. And those of you who have heard of Frederick Douglass, which I hope are all of you, Frederick Douglass is just beginning to appear on the abolitionist circuit at this time. He and Lunsford become friends, often travel together, but Douglass was the second billing at most abolitionist meetings to Lunsford originally. So that should give you a sense of Lunsford's celebrity and how popular he really was. Okay. This book, which is a biography of Lunsford, was written in 1863. And when it came out, that's the last anybody heard of Lunsford Lane. And he sort of disappeared from history. So much so that 30 years later, when Stephen Weeks is in a bookstore and he finds this book, he's shocked to even hear anything about a guy named Lunsford Lane. He had never even heard of it. So Lunsford had disappeared from history, and now he's sort of resurrected, and historians start writing about him. But the person they begin writing about isn't Lunsford Lane. It's a mythical guy who has a lot of qualities that don't necessarily reflect the reality of Lunsford Lane's life. Okay. Oh, there's the bow. This is it. There's the book. This is the book, the biography, written in 1863. Okay. Now, Lane, as I said, had disappeared from the historical record. In 1852, 40 years earlier, This guy, Martin Robinson Delaney, had not included Lunsford in the first history of Black America that was ever written. This is during Lunsford's lifetime. Left Lunsford out. William C. Nell published a book in 1855 called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. Don't let the title fool you. He talked about all sorts of Black Americans up into the 1850s in that book, but he didn't include Lunsford. These were people who knew Lunsford, who didn't think he was significant enough to include in Black history. The great abolitionist William Wells Brown published a book in 1863 titled The Black Man. All three of these, first three that I've mentioned, were active abolitionists. They would have known Lane, and yet they don't find him relevant to Black history. And again, Lane made no appearance in The History of the Negro Race, written by George Washington Williams in 1882. And so Lunsford didn't make this impact on history, but suddenly in mid-1890s, Samuel Weeks is going to bring Lunsford into everybody's vision. Now, and so ultimately, like the cemetery, I love the cemetery, like the cemetery where Lunsford is buried, somewhere around there, with no markers in that area, right? He disappeared. And the mythical Lane outlives the memory of the real Lane. Now, drawing from the biography, historians began to use Lunsford for a variety of purposes. Hawkins, the author of this biography, was writing during the Civil War. And he hoped that, this was his purpose for writing, that the integrity of character unfolded in the life of Lunsford Lane may inspire them, meaning the formerly enslaved, to the imitation of virtues, without which they can never secure the respect and sympathy of the good. Okay. That's just a lot of language to say that he viewed Lunsford as what was known at that time as the exceptional Negro. Or, as W.E.B. Du Bois would state it later on, the talented 10. That 10% of Black Americans were examples for the rest of Black America. And this became sort of the main theme of history about Black America at the time. The nature of Lunsford's exceptionalism became what historians became fascinated with. So we have a historian, another one from Trinity University, John Spencer Bassett, and he decided that Lunsford was exceptional because he had been an enslaved entrepreneur. He had practiced entrepreneurialism while he was enslaved. I can't tell you how screwed up this notion is. It was against the law for enslaved people in North Carolina to trade in tobacco, and yet Lunsford makes about $1,000, which today is about $18,000 in money based upon tobacco sales. And John Spencer Bassett is applauding this. John Spencer Bassett is writing in the 1790s. In the early 1900s, Du Bois praised Lunsford Lane as an exceptional minister of the gospel. And he had the confidence of the best people. A little problematic, Lunsford was very distrustful of Christianity, particularly organized religion. He believed that organized religion oppressed Black Americans rather than lifted them. And Lunsford, to my knowledge, never publicly prayed, never was a minister. But here's Du Bois, and right now you must be saying, and Du Bois was a great sociologist and historian, and some of you who know him, and here's Bassett, who's a historian, must be thinking to yourselves, do historians make stuff up? Yes, all the time. Booker T. Washington in the early 1910s said that Lunsford Lane gave the only abolition speech, as far as I know, ever made by a colored man before a Southern audience. Okay. Lunsford never spoke one word against slavery while he was in the South. And honestly, he never spoke one word against slavery while he was in the North. And so it's hard to claim that he's an abolitionist, even though he did speak on the abolitionist circuit. And the speech that Booker Washington is referring to was a speech where Lunsford was basically begging the mob not to hang him. And so it's hardly anti-slavery in its tone. Carter G. Woodson, who becomes the father of Black History Month, which we just concluded, right, called Lunsford a prominent Negro in the antebellum crisis because he was an abolitionist in the North. So Washington's like, he's a Southern abolitionist. Woodson, he's a Northern abolitionist. Historians were all over the place, arguing what made Lunsford exceptional. So we begin to have we begin to have several visions of a mythical Lane, but it's the entrepreneurial myth that has sort of yoked Lunsford's narrative for so long, for nearly 2 centuries. And this notion that Lunsford was an entrepreneur, from just a few lines in the narrative that Lunsford himself dictated in 1842. And here are the lines. In the early part of the night, I would sell my tobacco and pipes and manufacture them in the latter part. As the legislature sit in Raleigh every year, I sold these articles considerably to the members so that I became known not only in the city, but in many parts of the state as a tobacco maker. Okay. That's Lunsford trying to make a claim of significance for himself. This is actually not true. Lunsford's father is the one who did the tobacco. Lunsford did develop a pipe. He invented a pipe that had like a still, had a little tube coming out of it to release heat so that the pipe wouldn't burn your lips as you smoked tobacco. But Lunsford's father was taking really poor quality tobacco and flavoring it to mask how bad the quality was and then selling it for a nice dime, right? His father was enslaved as well. And so Lunsford sort of lays claim to this money-making enterprise, but it's a bit of an exaggeration. And unfortunately, it's just the beginning of this exaggeration of Lunsford as sort of a prototypical entrepreneur. And historians begin to latch on to this. By 1938, we have a beer company, Pfeiffer's Beer, and this is during the Great Depression. So work ethic is a big issue in the 1930s. We see that in histories written at that time. Proclaiming Lunsford a manufacturer, merchant, and lecturer. But the next line's the kicker. He had high achievements in spite of handicaps. What was his handicap? He was black. Lunsford himself, when he wrote his own narrative, didn't say that his troubles came from enslavement. The subtitle of his book is that he was punished for, quote, wearing the color of the dark skin, or of a colored skin. And so Lunsford was making a case never about slavery, but about race. And ironically, Pfeiffer's takes it and turns it around, that race was a handicap, that prohibited Lunsford from achieving much, but he overcomes it. He becomes a manufacturer and merchant. There he is out in the field picking tobacco, which isn't true. He was never on a tobacco farm. But we can just make stuff up. That's what historians and advertising executives do. And then a few years later, in the early 1950s, what's the name? Lola, I don't remember the name of the company. The Lorillard Company, which made Kent cigarettes. Some of you are old enough to remember Kent cigarettes, right? I don't think they make them anymore. But made Kent cigarettes, put a traveling exhibit together titled, and it's so offensive, Brown Skin and Bright Leaf. And here's the description. It's the story of the way the Negro and his one-time master, tobacco, have traveled through the centuries together to reach a time when master has become partner. Right? Yeah, is your mouth dropped open? It should be, right? And it portrays Lunsford in that exhibit as an early tobacco manufacturer who has marketed a superior brand of smoking tobacco. And it even gave the tobacco a name, Lane Tobacco. This name shows up nowhere else in the history, but this company just layers that title on it, right? Now you may say, okay, so people in the past and advertising executives are a little loose with history. They're trying to sell products or whatever, right? But then what happens? In 1999, Juliet E.K. Walker, who's a major historian of business, was at the University of Texas, declared that Lunsford had a home office and branch offices in several cities that provided outlets for the wholesale and retail distribution of his tobacco. Not true. None of that's true. Right? But now she's put that into the historical record that other historians read and begin to conceptualize what they're doing when they write things related to Lunsford or early black inventions or early black capitalist involvement. And so she took it one step further, right? Then, I'm fearful this is what you've read online. Then we have somebody in Raleigh who works for the Locke Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Raleigh. But he wrote a whole article about Lunsford, and here are his conclusions. Despite continual setbacks and persistent discrimination, Lane, like most entrepreneurs, was, and we shouldn't be surprised that a conservative think tank would emphasize entrepreneurialism is important to their vision of American society. Like most entrepreneurs, was influenced primarily by the prospects of a better tomorrow and the belief that an individual could improve his circumstances with powers of invention and an entrepreneurial spirit that bondage could not suppress. Lane, as a young man, started selling tobacco despite continual setbacks and persistent, oh, I already have that. Oh, Lane, like most entrepreneurs, was influenced primarily by prospects of circumstances. I don't know. Oh, I copied the same paragraph twice. I apologize. Okay, so it was only 2 paragraphs. But don't you feel a little patriotic now? Entrepreneurialism makes it possible for people to be good citizens in life. Okay. Now, you may say, oh, that's just some conservative twisting the story to advance it. But then we get Governor McCrory in 2014 sends out a proclamation for Black History Month, including a line that says, whereas African Americans from North Carolina made significant contributions to American arts, science, and industry, such as Lunsford Lane, believed to be the state's first African American inventor. Do you see how Lunsford's becoming increasingly significant? Who, while enslaved, invented a pipe and special tobacco blend rather than crappy tobacco covered up with flavoring that allowed him to purchase his freedom and move his family. And so historians have been tagging on, and this moves into public history as well. Here's the historic marker in Raleigh to Lunsford Lane, and there's that word entrepreneur in a very conspicuous place. We love it. If you go to the state capitol and read a banner about slavery at the Capitol, Lunsford wasn't even a slave. After he returned to North Carolina with his freedom, he was hired by the governor, Governor Dudley, to work in the governor's office. And he was the only black man or black person who worked in the Capitol building, who wasn't enslaved. Right? He was a very visible presence. The governor was a Whig and was somewhat anti-slavery. So this was a purposeful hire on their part. And then after Governor Dudley left office, Lunsford remained and served under Governor Moorhead, who was also a Whig. And so Lunsford had this very prominent place within the Capitol. He would guard the governor's doors when there were council meetings. He would deliver documents from the governor's office to the legislature. He filed documents away for the governor's secretary. He had an important role within that administration. And yet, what do they champion on the historical narrative about Lunsford Lane? He's selling tobacco. That's his job in the Capitol, selling tobacco. That notion of entrepreneurialism carries more weight than what he actually did. Okay. Now, Lane needed to work. After 1835, when he returned with his freedom, his goals were to eventually purchase his wife and children, but he also needed to sustain them. The man who enslaved his wife and children knew that Lunsford was trying to make money and insisted that Lunsford feed his family. So you can just imagine how difficult it was for Lunsford to actually save money towards anything. In fact, 7 years later, when Lunsford actually is able to free them, it's not a result of any money he made in North Carolina as a free black man. It's all donations from Northern abolitionists. So, after 1840, so before 1840, he had, and I had to count them twice, before 1840, he had 7 children. After 1840, he had 9. One child didn't make it beyond a couple months. As you can see from the family tree here, only a few of the children grew up to adulthood, and only 2 of them married, to my knowledge, and only 1 of them had children of their own. So this is a family tree that actually dies out in 1997. The last descendant died in 1997. When Lunsford is able to escape North Carolina and take his family with him, he also was able to take his mother with him, and within a year, his father fled North Carolina and joined them. And so this is amazingly a family that was enslaved that remains intact before emancipation. This was very rare to have 3 generations be able to escape and live together in the North. Lunsford lived in many places, and his family lived in many places. And if you saw last night's show, you've already heard this. But this is the list of where they lived with the years. The ones with asterisks are places where Lunsford actually purchased property. And so Lunsford purchased 7 properties over his lifetime. Sadly, 5 of them he would lose to foreclosure. He wasn't very good with money. Okay. Not much of an entrepreneur. He lost 5 to foreclosure or abandonment, where the family just left. And then the ones where the underlines are when he abandoned his family and went off and lived somewhere else for a while and tried to do some sort of job. His wife Martha and the children who were with her are just struggling to get by during that time. The one that's in italics, Timbuktu, he actually had land in upstate New York, but he never went there. He never followed that dream. Okay, now, the reason I show you this is I also want to show you when he's in each of these places, these are the jobs he did. So number 1, and you know, the students in here, most of you are in here because you're planning to learn how to establish a career eventually, and you're probably focusing on one thing. I'm going to become a lawyer, or a doctor, or a college professor. I'm going to do that. This is not how Americans in the 19th century thought. Okay. First of all, capitalism isn't in place yet. There are capitalistic patterns that have emerged in the United States, but capitalism as a system is still being conceptualized, which I'll talk about more in a second. So people went from job to job. This is something that historians have noticed more and more lately. Benjamin Franklin was a prime example of this, who took on many careers or many jobs over his lifetime in order to survive. Lunsford is a prime, and those people are called piddlers. It's peddlers with an I, piddlers. Okay. And piddlers are people who do a variety of jobs. And so Lunsford, while he was enslaved during his first 33 years, Afterwards, he's in Raleigh for 6 more years, and he takes on several different types of ways of making money. And what's sort of interesting, he's a valet, and I use that term lightly. What he really did is he hung around downtown bars at night, and when state legislatures would get too drunk, he would escort them to their hotel rooms and put them to bed. He would then go wake them up in the morning with a special hangover concoction so they could then go to the state capitol and do their job, right? And they tip him well for that. That's his valeting. Or shop window, oh, I lost a word, designing. He would go to the shops along Fayetteville Street in Raleigh, and he would get the shopkeepers to pay him to put their things out on the street and set up visuals for people to look at so they might purchase goods, right? So he's doing this hodgepodge of things in North Carolina. When he goes to Boston, he primarily is a speaker. When he purchased that land in Timbuktu, he was imagining becoming a farmer, which he had zero preparation for. As an enslaved man, he worked in the townhouse. He took care of the horses. He did the shopping for the family. Those were his. He learned a little gardening from his parents, both of whom were gardeners, but he was no farmer, which is probably part of the reason he never took off after that dream. When he moves to Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, he becomes an intelligence officer. And this was the term used for helping people who are runaway enslaved folk find jobs, find security, find ways to escape to Canada if they need to. So he's providing intelligence to people so that they can live their lives. Right? And so you can see he takes on many jobs. The ones in yellow, governor's aide and hospital steward, are the only 2 jobs he ever had that had consistent pay. And so Lunsford was never stable financially, which is part of the reason we have foreclosures on his houses, part of the reason that the family struggles over time, and eventually his wife leaves him after the children grow up. And last evening I was talking about this as one of the reasons, the financial instability. But one thing I left out last night is 4 of their children die young. And you know, when you have children die one after another, 3 of those died to tuberculosis, which is a violent disease. You know, when you see that over and over again, it also erodes the core of family life. And then on a couple of occasions, he makes vegetable pills, which are, you just go get things like beetroot and smush it into pills and sell it to people, vegetable pills. None of these things was he particularly successful in economically in doing. Okay, so returning to this map. So one of the things a historian has to do is, and the reason I'm telling you all of this is I early recognized that there's this myth about Lunsford being this great entrepreneur, but the little bit of research I've done so far, which I've shared with you on these screens, tells me that he wasn't very good at it. So why are we celebrating it? Particularly in local history or public history, right? Why are we telling people this is what he could achieve? And so that's sort of one of the questions I began wrestling with as a researcher. So what sort of sources do I need to find in order to unravel how much of an entrepreneur, how financially wise Lunsford was? So let's return to the foreclosures. I had to go to every town in which he had owned property and sit there and go through mortgage records and court records, because every time there was a foreclosure, the people foreclosing on him took him to court. Most of the properties that he owned, that has an asterisk, except in Raleigh, all the other properties that he owned had at least 2 mortgages on them. A primary mortgage, a secondary mortgage, some of them had a tertiary mortgage. Now, this is before modern mortgage law. Mortgage law is just being developed in the 1830s and 1840s. If you wanted to buy a house, you didn't go to a realtor, there was no such thing. And you didn't go to a bank for a loan. Banks didn't give loans to individuals. Banking is just taking shape at this time. And so what you did is you went to somebody who owned a house and you offered to buy it from them at certain rates, and it would be written down in the deed what your payment was each month. And they're basically funding your acquisition of the house. So then I want some more money. I go to somebody else and I say, hey, I know you have some money. What's wrong? Oh, what'd I do?
Just keep going, you didn't do it.
I want some more money. Here's the title to the property. Give me $6,000, and then if I can't pay you back, you can take me to court and foreclose on this title. Okay. But now what has he created? Every time he had at least 2 mortgagers, when he skipped out on paying and left the property, both of them have to go fight it out in court to see who's going to win and who's going to get paid. Right? So every time Lunsford didn't pay the mortgages and keep the property, he screwed somebody financially. Somebody always lost money with Lunsford Lane. He's sort of like the president. But you know the president and his casinos and all that. Okay. So even the property in Raleigh, which I'll talk more about in a second, even the property in Raleigh, Lunsford just left Raleigh, didn't sell it. Okay. He promised it to the guy who enslaved his wife and children as part of the payment, but that guy had no right to it because other people had signed the mortgage with Lunsford, and they laid claim to it. So that guy lost the money he had invested in paying off Lunsford's bail on 2 occasions when Lunsford was jailed in Raleigh, in providing financial assistance to Lunsford and his wife. And so like everybody who sort of economically interacts with Lunsford loses money in the process. So he wasn't just a poor entrepreneur and financial manager himself. He really injured other people, in particular his wife and children, who struggled in the world that he created. So the property in Raleigh is a good example of the process that I described to you. So here's the title to his land. He purchased it in 1838 from Weston Gales. And it's about 1/8 of a block in downtown Raleigh that he purchased. The title says he bought it for the sum of $53.50. Now this is one of the moments when I was researching and I went, aha, something's wrong. Lunsford's trying to act more economically astute than he actually is. In that biography, which Lunsford sat and was interviewed for in 1863, he said, and in his narrative in 1842, he said the property was worth $500. 53,500 is not, it was worth $53. And yet he magnified it by tenfold and claimed that it was worth that much. So he's trying to impress somebody, his readers, about how astute he is, how able he is to increase property value. It never was worth $500 during the 19th century, at least. And so as a historian, you sort of see something like that, and then you determine that you have to figure out what's going on, right? And you have to start researching multiple places, multiple government and transactional documents, looking in store ledgers to see if Lunsford's ever purchasing things in local stores, and if so, what, and to what end, and is he purchasing it on credit? Yes, he was. Or with cash? No, he wasn't. Right? And so he's racking up even more debt. Okay, so let's, okay. Now, so as the historian, I go look at primary sources and try to piece together what's going on. But ultimately, the answers aren't there. Lunsford was mostly illiterate, so he may have dictated a narrative, and here's his narrative. that he dictated, and here's the biography of 1863. He had a voice. His voice is here, but he didn't write the words. Somebody else wrote the words, and sometimes they exaggerated things, like selling tobacco, right? Because these are abolitionists who want northern white audiences to believe that free black people coming into the north will contribute economically. They're not problematic economically. And many of them weren't, but Lunsford was. Right? But we don't want anybody to recognize that. Okay? So, I can engage the primary sources, but just as important is contextualizing him in the secondary literature. Okay? What was going on? What have historians determined over time was going on in America at this time, particularly for free black Americans? Right? There were three contexts in which I place Lunsford Lane in the book. Number one, self-making. Self-making, and my suspicion is you have heard a little bit about this before, because high school social studies love to use the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin as a primary example of a self-made man. This was published in 1793 during the period of nation-making in the United States. And what does it say? Here's somebody who was born poor, who struggled, who made a career for himself, eventually in printing, who became one of the great founding fathers, right? This movement from poverty to greatness. That notion of self-making was very powerful in the United States when Lunsford came of age. 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, when he's on the lecture circuit. Self-making is what everybody aspires to be. It's not entrepreneurialism, because it's pre-capitalistic in its values. You just work as hard as you can at whatever is offered to you in order to make money, to improve yourself, and to elevate your status. Self-making. Second context, black self-making. Self-making was identified as white. There was nobody who identified a black man as, and never a black woman, black man as self-making before 1850. And who do you think becomes the first black self-made man? Any guess? Yeah, but no. No. You want to say Lunsford, but I'm tricking you. Huh?
I said Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, yes. Frederick Douglass was a self-promoter. He thought about his image constantly, and so he creates this image of self-making that helps him tremendously over his career in the North. But Lunsford is attempting it in these stories, and it just doesn't latch on because it's incongruent with the reality of Lunsford's life, that he's constantly losing property, that his family is constantly struggling economically. Okay. And then there's the concept of entrepreneurialism itself. Oh, there's Douglas. This guy, Jean-Baptiste Say, was a French business professor. He created the first business school on the globe in Paris, and he did it in the 1830s, okay. Which tells you business as a career goal doesn't exist before the 1830s. In the 1830s, it's becoming conceptualized. How do you prepare people to run businesses? Which means there must be some rules to business that exist. Capitalism, right? And so the concept of capitalism is being forged at this time and unified into set ideas about supply and demand and retail and wholesale and so on, so things that you're probably familiar with in a general sense. Okay. Say comes up with the term entrepreneur, which in French means between takers. So one person creates something and I take it from them, and they take my money from me. Between takers. This is something piddlers have been doing for centuries. And for that reason, Jean-Baptiste Say really struggled to figure out how piddlers fit into capitalism. Because piddlers may take something, but they're not going to reinvest it. They're not going to organize it. They're not going to market it. They're not going to do anything but just take the money and go out and buy some beer or go out and whatever they're going to spend money on. Food, clothing for their children, or whatever. They're consumers as well, right? For that reason, Jean-Baptiste Say rejected piddlers as capitalists, as entrepreneurs. And he said what he really meant by entrepreneur is entrepreneurs of industry, people who organize businesses, people who manage labor, who manage profits, right? And so this concept of entrepreneurialism is coming into being at the same time Lunsford is struggling to get by in the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s. And it's in these three contexts of self-making, black self-making, and entrepreneurialism that I had to place Lunsford in order to draw conclusions about how entrepreneurial he really was, in contrast to the way in which he's been remembered both by academic historians and public historians. So entrepreneur is only one of the myths about Lunsford Lane that I had to tackle. Another one was his Christian faith and how deep or how shallow it was. Another one was he truly an abolitionist in the South and in the North? These are mythologies that historians created that I really worked towards trying to explain and explore in order to get a better sense of who Lunsford Lane was as a real person and rather, and not the mythical person. Whoops. So that's it. So thank you. I hope you learned something. So, we have time for questions or thoughts or anything. Anything you want to talk about? Yes.
Would you please talk about Lunsford Lane's relationship and friendship with Frederick Douglass?
Sure. So, they had an uneven friendship. Lunsford arrived in Massachusetts in the fall of 1841. Frederick Douglass gave his first public speech in July of 1841. And so they're arriving roughly at the same time. Both of them become speakers, often paired together. And for about 3 years, they actually traveled together, both before Lunsford's acquires his freedom and then his family, and then after the family arrives with him in New England. They're traveling around, giving talks, only in New England. Okay. But every talk they give is in the newspapers. And so these are emerging celebrities. Okay. Originally, Douglass, who his very first speech sort of set the stage for who he was as an orator, was angry and demanded the end of slavery. So Douglass very quickly becomes the embodiment of the angry black man in the North. And that was particularly useful to Lane, because Lane wasn't angry. Lane was paternal. He worried about his family. He wanted to save them from slavery. Lane became the embodiment of the caring black father. And so you had two images of black manhood on the stage at the same time, which was very appealing to audiences, because abolitionist audiences didn't want to believe in some sort of monolithic ideal of black manhood. They wanted to see variety in black manhood because they're fighting to save black men and their families. During that first year, when Lunsford and Frederick are speaking together, Lunsford's soliciting money. Now, philosophically, Frederick Douglass opposed the idea of purchasing enslaved people and giving them freedom. Like most abolitionists, he believed that this was actually contributing to the slave markets in the South. It made slaves more valuable, and so the prices will go up and there'll be more effort to trade enslaved people. So abolitionists largely oppose this. But here's Lane saying, give me money to help me go buy my family. And most abolitionists sitting in the audiences, several of them, you know, I read letters where they went to view Lane and Douglass talking, and they're like really torn about whether they should donate to Lane or not, because if they do, then they're contributing to the slave market, right? But Lane's very successful. He raises the money to go get his family, but Douglass speaks against it on most occasions, but then he would always give a caveat. I'm opposed to this philosophically, but here's a brother asking for my help and asking for your help, okay? And we should help them. Sort of the kicker here is that Douglass was opposed to this until it came time that people wanted to buy his freedom, because he was still enslaved. And when someone decided to purchase Douglass's freedom for him, suddenly he was pro-purchase, as was William Lloyd Garrison, who was the leader of the white abolitionists, who had opposed it all along. This should also give you a sense that the abolitionist movement wasn't unified. They're constantly having fights over tactics. And this is part of their annual meetings, these debates over how we can end slavery in the United States. Lunsford was very much vocal about it early on, that he believed in being able to purchase people. But over the 1840s and into the 1850s, the abolitionist movement became more radical and violent, and Lunsford was not eager to participate in that. So he disappeared from the abolitionist movement as the abolitionist movement became more eager to end slavery against what they now call the slave power. So. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes?
I have a question about your research, and you might have covered this last night, but I haven't had a chance. In the early authors, the black authors that you put up who did not include Lunsford in their books, have you, or is there evidence in there, if they have archives, if there are archival papers, I have no idea, that choice, like, or correspondence, or is there any evidence that they made that conscious decision or had any interaction with Lunsford? And why, like, is there evidence to why or why not he is not in there?
So I'm fairly certain, although I have no direct evidence, I'm fairly certain that Lunsford, that communications with Lunsford sort of ended by 1855 between him and the old abolitionist crowd, because he was no longer engaged in abolitionism, and he sort of disappears physically from the places where he had been involved in speaking. So no, oh, something went through my head I was going to tell you and I have forgotten. So those guys, oh, now I remember. Those guys who wrote those early black histories, I didn't go through all of their papers, but two of them I did go through their papers, and there's no mention of decision making or Lunsford or anything. So they just see him outside of the history of abolitionism in black America for the most part. But what I remembered was when Lunsford died in 1879, another abolitionist wrote Frederick Douglass. And this is at the special collections at Howard University in DC. And the abolitionist says, I have discovered that Lunsford Lane died. We didn't know where he was. So that sort of tells you the disconnect. And then he declares Lunsford sort of the first of the black founding fathers to die, right? And he lists several others, including Douglass and William Wells Brown, but Lunsford's the first to go, which means that he knew the others were alive, right? So they had sustained communication, and Lunsford has sort of disappeared from their sphere. Yeah. Any of you history majors? Not one. So sad. So sad.
Are you all here as part of a class?
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot, what is the class?
Women and gender studies. No, the history class.
Yeah.
Mhm. Women and Gender Studies.
If I had known you were gender, because I do a lot with masculinity in the book. I talk a lot about black masculinity in particular, but white masculinity as well. And one thing I brought up last evening that I just love, one of my favorite things is that when his wife starts purchasing property, and she's illiterate, and she starts purchasing property in Worcester, Massachusetts, while Lunsford's away in North Carolina, and the two oldest daughters are purchasing property with her. And I had to learn all about women's property rights in Massachusetts at that time, which is just a web of laws and exceptions. Women could buy property, but they could not second mortgage property without their husband's permission. And what do you think Lunsford? So Lunsford was in North Carolina in 1865, early 66. He comes home. Martha has bought property. He goes to the old house. She's not even there. The house has been sold. He finds out where she and the daughters are. He goes, lives with them. They're only like half a mile away. Okay. And what do you think the first thing he did when he saw Martha that first week? I've talked about it several times today. He took out a second mortgage on the property, right? So typical. And you may say, what was wrong with him that he would do this? Why keep mortgaging? And that's another conundrum I had to figure out. Why did he have this attitude? And what I discovered is, before Lunsford became sort of the premier free black man in Raleigh, there was a guy named John Chavis. And John Chavis was a schoolmaster. He taught black and white students until the white parents told him he couldn't teach black students anymore. And if he was going to get paid, he had to teach the white students. And then the state passes a law that black children can't be educated. And so he's sort of illegally teaching black children at night how to read. Here's John Chavis. He's the example of black manhood in Raleigh when Lunsford is coming of age. And John Chavis is up to his nose in mortgage debt. Okay. And you might say, why is John Chavis doing that? Because every white man in Raleigh mortgages over and over and over again. The people who enslaved Lunsford and his mother and his father were some of the most powerful and wealthiest people in North Carolina, the Haywoods. Every single one of those brothers, there are four of them, every single one of them die so much in debt that their widows have to make decisions about what properties to sell, what enslaved properties to sell in order to keep the house. Right? And so enslaved families get busted up every time one of those men die because they don't worry about debt. Just keep racking it up, particularly mortgage debt, loan debt. Just keep racking it up because your wife will have to deal with it. You don't have to. This is the type of financial manhood that Lunsford learned. He was around those wealthy whites all the time, those wealthy white men. He was around John Chavis. This is what he learned, and he enacted it in every place he went. Anything else? It's probably closing time, but yes.
From your discussion of him, in your book, are you portraying Lunsford as a villain or a hero or?
He's a person.
Yeah.
Right? That's one thing I try to do, and I start out very early in the introduction, is that, and I told this last night, a really great biographer once said, you start out loving your biographical subject, almost romantically. And I was so smitten with Lunsford Lane for like 3 years until I discovered that Lunsford did some really crappy things. And then I'm like, and this biographer said you start out romantically in love with your subject, but eventually you either come to really hate them or you distrust them. I distrust Lunsford. I don't think Lunsford was honest in his self-presentation. And so that's where I've come down with Lunsford. But one of the things I say in the introduction is it's really unfair that we force upon black historical Americans, that we force upon them meeting the idea that they had agency or they had activism. And if they didn't do either of those, then we sort of don't recognize them. And my argument is that we need to acknowledge Lunsford because he persisted. You know, he was a human trying to move through life, and he faced all sorts of obstacles. Some he failed dramatically, others he achieved. You know, I mean, one of the greatest things he did is he was a hospital steward during the Civil War. He took care of injured Massachusetts fighters, he and his wife and daughters. You know, he contributed to the war effort in that regard. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Friend. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate this.
Thank you.
And come take a look on your way out. Come see the original materials that Megan pulled for us.
And thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no problem. Is the fourth edition of his narrative?
It's the second
It's not the first
edition of his
Isn't
narrative.
it?
Oh,
Yeah.
no, it's the fourth
It's the
edition.
fourth, yeah. So, yeah, it got reprinted a lot.
It had 4 editions.
Yeah.